You're heading south of the Mason-Dixon. This is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. This is Brian McClanahan, and this is episode 19. We're already up to episode 19. It's pretty amazing. And this covers the week of March 21 through March 25, 2016. Glad to be back. Glad to have another good week of material at the Abbeville Institute for your reading pleasure, and also for this podcast, material for this podcast. So we got a lot to talk about. First and foremost, I want to mention our summer school, which comes up in June 12th through 17th, 2016. Information can be found on that at the Abbeville Institute website, abbevilleinstitute.org. Also, please consider making a tax-deductible contribution to the Abbeville Institute. We exist on your donations, and any support you can give us will help us explore what is true and valuable in the Southern tradition. So please consider that when you're making your financial plans. For as little as less than $5 a month in the lowest membership, you can become a member of the Institute, and it's a great way to help us keep this podcast going, to help us keep the website going, and to help us plan conferences and events for education. So that's what we're all about. We're trying to get the message out there. And I'm actually going to start this week, before I get to the articles, we've actually been running a couple of ads on social media. And the responses to those ads is often funny. Because, of course, when you run something on social media, you don't always just get people that like you seeing the ads, and so they tend to comment on things. And one of the ads we ran was simply an ad trying to get people to help us support the Institute. And there was a comment, and a lot of the comments have gone this way to people that don't like us. Of course, one of the ads we're running is simply an ad promoting the article by Dr. Wilson, Why the War Was Not About Slavery. And, of course, that's been a lot of fun because people tend to comment with some ridiculous assertions. Of course, there are some fairly interesting intellectual debates on that particular issue as well, but a lot of times it's a flippant dismissal of anything that might refute the standard narrative that the war was, or how the war was about slavery. I mean, I think that's really the question that you have to ask, is how slavery was important in the 19th century. Obviously it was important, but how was it important, and why was it important? And it's that moral side that often is used as saying, well, I mean, it was all about the moral attack on slavery in the North, or the moral defense of slavery in the South. And so this is where you get into this debate about slavery and the moral issue. But of course, one thing that people often cannot do because they don't have the background that I think, fortunately, a lot of our listeners at the Abbeville Institute have, and that's the perspective of secession and the long view. Meaning they don't understand that secession was actually first discussed under the Constitution in 1794 by two Northern congressmen, Ellsworth and King, when they cornered John Taylor of Caroline and said, hey, John, look, this thing isn't working. What do you think about the North seceding? And, of course, it was brought up in 1800 when Thomas Jefferson was elected, or at least going through the election process, and that had to go through the House of Representatives. It was brought up in 1803 after the Louisiana Purchase. It was brought up in 1815 at the Hartford Convention. All these issues, all these times, the North was bringing up secession, so obviously they believed that it was legal and could happen. And then, as you move forward in time, the South starts to discuss it as the North gains some political traction. There's a situation where no one knows really who's going to be dominating the government. And then, of course, abolitionists openly discussed secession. They thought secession was perfectly legal, and actually the way that they could have their free soil republic. They thought they would just secede from the Union. William Lloyd Garrison said it was what they needed to do. We ran an article, of course, about Lysander Spooner, who's a very much unknown, unless you're a libertarian, abolitionist who thought the South should just go in peace. So this issue of secession is, I think, the heart of what we're trying to do. And I've written before that secession is perfectly legal. But I wanted to read one of the comments, because this is often what you hear when you start talking about secession. And that's, one commenter said that the tragedy was not the Emancipation Proclamation, it was the acts of treason by the state leaders who purported to secede and who formed a traitorous conspiracy under the name of the Confederate States of America. I'm proud that 3 of my answers fought against that conspiracy, 2 of them giving their lives to defeat it. So this is the argument that's often used. Well, this is all treason. So if you're not going to talk about slavery, if you say, okay, well, let's just leave that issue aside, then people fall back on the comment of treason. The South was committing treason in 1860-61. And so there's a lot of ways to combat this argument. First and foremost, and some people don't, and I actually saw this too, when you retort, well, if 1860 and 61 was treason, then what was 1776? And of course, the British would have said in 1776 what the American colonists was doing was treason, but of course they said it wasn't. I mean, some said recognize that we could be called traitors or committing treason in this particular case. But what is treason? I mean, if we're going to say we believe in self-determination, which is the fundamental cornerstone of the American political experience, self-determination, Lincoln himself said it over and over again. So what is treason? Well, if you look at 1776 and you look at that federal republic that was formed, it wasn't a singular republic, but the federal republic that was ultimately formed by the Articles of Confederation, every state in 1776 legally recognized slavery. And the British actually said that the reason the South wanted to leave in 1776 was because they wanted to protect slavery. But every state in 1776 recognized slavery as a legal institution. And so oftentimes you hear this argument, well, the Southern governments were not legitimate because they had slavery. Well, if that's the case, then none of the governments in 1776 were legitimate either, because every state government in 1776, as they formed states, recognized slavery as a legal institution. And if you say that secession was not legal in 1661, then the act of withdrawing from the British Empire in 1776 was not legal either. Now, I know people say this is not really secession, this is rebellion in 1776. You can look at it sort of that way because, I mean, the idea of secession is the opposite of accession. You're acceding to the Constitution, then you're seceding from that. The states acceded to the document and then seceded from that. But in reality, the way that the British colonists thought of the British Constitution and the Empire in 1776 was no different than the way Americans thought of the Federal Constitution in 1861 in the nature of the general government. In 1776, the colonists believed that the general government could handle commerce and defense, and that was it. But not internal taxes, not internal questions, nothing that had to do with the internal affairs of the internal police of the colonies. And that was one of the this is why the American War for Independence was a constitutional crisis. In 1860 and 61, you have the same idea. So in both cases, you could say it was a constitutional crisis that the South was debating. And of course, you can look at issues and how those work, but this is a constitutional crisis. The nature of the Union, the nature and powers of the central authority was up for question in 1776 and also 1860 and 61. And if you use that word traitor and treason, you have to be able to define what treason was. And if you look at the Constitution, treason is defined as waging war against them. And who are them? Well, the states. So in that particular way, Lincoln was committing an act of treason if he says that the states are still in the Union. And this is where you get into these gray areas about were the states out of the Union, were they in the Union. Lincoln said they weren't out of the Union. This is an act of rebellion. Well, if you're going to say that, then you have to have permission from the state governments to send in the military, as per Article 4 of the Constitution. So in that case, he's violating the Constitution there. And not only that, waging war against them, meaning the states, is an act of treason. Lincoln himself was committing an act of treason from the executive branch. Now, if the states had actually seceded, than firing on Fort Sumter, which was the most telegraphed military move, and perhaps in all of American history. The South informed Fort Sumter they were going to fire on it, so it's telegraphed. But this was, if the South has actually seceded legally, which I would say they have, I mean, by popular convention in large numbers. This is also a funny argument. Well, the majority of the people of the Union were against secession, and so therefore it didn't happen. If you look at the South, you had larger majorities in those secession conventions voting for independence than you had in 1776. You know, and there was another post in these threads. The majority of the people in 1776 supported that war, and then not the majority of the people in 1860-61. In what section? You had crushing majority supporting independence in the South. And so this is really where the issue gets, and this is what Spooner essentially was saying, and the abolitionist secessionists saying, look, I mean, these people want to leave, let them go. It doesn't matter the issues. This is self-determination. And I think that's the thing we have to think about with secession. And Lincoln himself said in 1848 that he supported self-determination. So when people say it's treason, they have no concept of American constitutionalism and American political thought. They simply regurgitate something that they believe is accurate, that anytime you oppose a central authority, you're committing treason. That's not the American political tradition. And so we have to be very careful with that, and I think that, again, listening to podcasts like this and reading the material we put on the website, one of the most important things you can get out of all of this is being able to defend that original Constitution, being able to defend the Southern position constitutionally. And so if you go out and look up, if you look me up and then look up I wrote a piece for the American Conservative entitled "Is Secession Legal?" And I go through the arguments and explain why secession was legal in 1661 and why it was legal anyone brought it up before that. I mean, obviously in 1794, if Oliver Ellsworth and Rufus King, who were both at their state ratifying conventions and the Philadelphia Convention, thought that secession was legal, and you look at Northern advocates of secession in 1800 and 1803, and even into 1815, a lot of these people were members of the state ratifying conventions and Philadelphia Convention. They had been members of the general government, served in cabinet-level positions. These people were not just nobodies who thought, well, we're just going to secede. That wasn't the case. They understood that this was highly possible, and in fact, if you look at the ratifying conventions and you look at debates, several states had resumption clauses that if the general government abuses powers, they could just simply withdraw from this union. The act of accession means that you can secede. And the way that the South did it was in a manner that was consistent with the American political tradition, using conventions. Conventions are the key to all of this because they speak for the people. People would say, well, this is just a slave power. These are the political leaders, the slavers who are coercing people to support secession. No, these were popularly elected conventions from the people that voted on secession, and there were a lot of people who weren't necessarily certain this was the best course of action, and there was a great amount of debate in these conventions about what to do. And if you read those convention debates, you see that they were critically and seriously thinking about these issues and what they should do. And if this stuff was the right move to make, or if it was legal, I mean, they wrestled with all of these things. They weren't just hothead individuals beholden to the quote-unquote slave power. And I think that's something we have to get out of all this. So, that said, like us on social media too, because we do post everything there that we do. And so go out and like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter. We do have a YouTube channel where we post videos. We're in the process of uploading the videos from our 2015 summer school. We've uploaded a couple, and we're going to continue to do that. So go out there and view our social media and share it around, because this is the way you spread the message. So let's talk about the articles for the week. The first was a little piece by Bernard Thursam, and this was essentially a letter that was written by William Tecumseh Sherman. And so this is just being reprinted here. But when you look at what Sherman had said about the South, you get no other impression that this was a war of extermination, that saving the Union would allow the Union complete ascendancy over the South. And that was the point. And this letter was written to the head of the Army of the Tennessee in Huntsville. And so actually one of the lost parts of Sherman's war in the South near the end of the war is Alabama. North Alabama was suffering under the federal heel for several months before you had this March to the Sea, and there was a corresponding March to the Sea through Alabama, through North Alabama, and then ultimately ending up in Columbus, Georgia, where the same type of activities that Sherman used going through Georgia to Savannah and then north into Columbia, South Carolina, they did the same exact things, and this march through Alabama. And so if you look at what Sherman was saying, here's what he says. I'm going to read you a quote. This is from William Tecumseh Sherman about the South. If the people, or any of them, keep up a correspondence with parties in hostility, they are spies and can be punished with death or minor punishment. These are well-established principles of war, and the people of the South, having appealed to war, are barred from appealing to our Constitution, which they have practically and publicly defied. They have appealed to war and must abide its rules and laws. The United States, as a belligerent party claiming right in the soil as the ultimate sovereign, have a right to change the population, and it may be, and it both politic and best, that we should do so in certain districts. When the inhabitants persist too long in hostility, it may be both politic and right that we should banish them and appropriate their lands to a more loyal and useful population. No man would deny that the United States would be benefited by dispossessing a single prejudiced, hard-headed, and disloyal planter and substitute in his place a dozen or more patient, industrious, good families, even if they be of foreign birth. So think about that for a second. We're going to get rid of these people that have been in the United States as loyal Americans, following the American tradition for generations, with foreign-born people. We're just going to take them off their land. We're going to dispossess them because we claim that land as the United States. That's our land. That's not the original Federal Republic. The United States didn't own the land. The United States wasn't sovereign over the land. But the states were, and then the individual private property. And so Sherman actually addresses this in the next part. It is all idle nonsense for these Southern planters to say they made the South, that they own it, and that they can do as they please, even to break up our government and to shut up the natural avenues of trade, intercourse, and to break up our government. We know, and they know, if they are intelligent beings, that as compared with the whole world, they are but as 5 millions as to the 1,000 millions, that they did not create the land, that their only title to its use and enjoyment is the deed of the United States. And if they appeal to war, they hold their all by a very insecure tenure. So they only have this land because the United States says you can have this land. I mean, this is lunacy. It's insanity on the part of Sherman. He has no concept of American government. For my part, Sherman again, I believe that this war is a result of a false political doctrine for which we are all as a people responsible, viz., that any and every people has a right to self-government. Huh. Who says people have a right to self-government? In this belief, while I assert for our government the highest military prerogatives, I am willing to bear in patience that political nonsense of states' rights, freedom of conscience, freedom of press, and other such trash as have deluded the Southern people into war, anarchy, bloodshed, and the foulest crimes that have disgraced any time or any people. So who do these people think they are, that they have freedom of conscience and freedom of press and other such trash? That's political nonsense, according to William Tecumseh Sherman. This is the hero of the North. This is the guy that just recently was given a statue in Columbia, South Carolina, the man that burned the city. One of our great sacrosanct heroes. It's almost bewildering how this individual, and this statement, I mean, this is what people thought in the North, that self-determination was just trash. Right to self-government is just trash. You don't have that because you have your land at our pleasure. And this is what the United States government obviously thinks, but this is what Sherman was saying, and this is moving forward. This is what we have in the United States today. You don't have private property. You have property because we say you have it. You didn't build that. That's the nationalist argument. That's the idea that the United States is the sovereign. But remember, the states created the United States, so this is where you get into this idea of secession, as I started the podcast with. If you acceded to it, you can secede from it. And so Sherman goes on to say, to those who submit to the rightful law and authority, all gentleness and forbearance. But to the petulant and persistent secessionist, why? Death is mercy. And the quicker he or she is disposed of, the better. Well, there you go. And of course, if the government of the United States has in North Alabama any and all rights which they choose to enforce in war, to take their lives, their homes, their lands, their everything, and war is simply power unrestrained by constitution or compact. If they want eternal welfare, well and good. We will accept the issue and dispossess them and put our friends in possession. There you go. Many, many people with less pertinacity than the South have been wiped out of national existence. We're just going to wipe them out. When people ask in these threads and looking at the comments why people in the South held on to the quote-unquote lost cause, which I've pointed out, it's not really the myth, it's the nationalist myth. What Sherman is perpetuating here is a myth. Somehow that this idea of government is American. Sherman's idea, it's not. They wonder why people have held on to this idea of self-determination, self-government, and we look at it, and this is what they say. Well, I mean, this is what Sherman essentially is saying is happening here. These people believe they have self-government. My gosh, these people are just foolish because the United States is sovereign. This is why people hung on to it. So, read Sherman. I mean, it's eye-opening when you read William Tecumseh Sherman. And, of course, his wife was just as nasty, saying that Southerners should be exterminated. The piece on Tuesday was The Destruction of Old Sheldon Church and Other Ravages of War by Gail Jarvis. This is a piece that was published years ago. And I'm not going to... It's a nice, long piece that gets into Sheldon Church in Charleston, South Carolina, and how it gets into Sherman's march through Georgia and the Carolinas, and how this church is kind of the personification of the destruction of the South in so many ways, or at least a nice example of that, and how not just the aim of this invasion was not simply just through the end of the war, was not just to rid the South of anything that could be used for the Confederate government and the military effort, but also civilian property, churches, schools, anything. And how brutal this march through the South actually was, and how many churches were burned in the South. And this is a nice example of that, this old Sheldon Church. And Gail Jarvis points out, the levels of destruction inflicted by Union troops devastated the infrastructure, economy, and resources of the South to such an extent that it took nearly an entire century for Southern states to recover. Opportunistic politicians took advantage of the enfeebled condition of the broken region to seize yet more powerful Washington. As the Revolutionary War followed the founders to create a republic, the war between the states set in motion conditions that would essentially destroy the founders' vision of a republic based on limited government. I think one thing we have to get here is that we have a federal republic, not a singular republic. If we can use the proper definition, and also call that government in Washington, D.C. what it is, the general government, or the central government, not the federal government, because there's nothing federal about it anymore. The rights of the states enumerated in the 10th Amendment were eviscerated, and over the years the central government's restrictions on the free will of citizens would far exceed the British monarchy's restraints on subjects in 1776, restraints that prodded American colonies to courageously declare their independence. Atlanta, Columbia, and other fatalities of Sherman's campaign through Georgia and the Carolinas have been rebuilt, but the old Sheldon Church has not. Visitors today can view the ruins as Union troops left them in 1865. For many, visiting the ruins can be a melancholy experience. All that remains of a once flourishing house of worship is a burned-out shell, columns supporting nothing, and cadaverous walls that echo no prayers, a somber reminder of the ravages of war. Of course, it was also burned out during the American War for Independence, so this is what he's getting into. It's a great article. I recommend reading it. Gail Jarvis is a great writer. He always produces very good stuff for us, and it's a nice romp through South Carolina history, not just the war in 1861 to 65, but also the war before that. On Wednesday, another edition in the Sayings by or for Southerners, Part 28 for Clyde Wilson, and a couple of interesting ones here. One that we posted on social media by Marco Polo, written in 1295, so the 13th century. He said this: "The Muslim inhabitants are treacherous and unprincipled. According to their doctrine, whatever is stolen or plundered from others of a different faith is properly taken, and the theft is no crime. These principles are common to all the Saracens." And so we just had an issue of terrorism here in Brussels, and Jefferson dealt with the Muslims in North Africa when he was president, and his reaction to that. It's a very interesting quote. There's also a great quote from wife of William Tecumseh Sherman, so it fit with our first two pieces in discussing Sherman and that wonderful, kind-hearted individual he was. And his wife, so sweet. I mean, this woman's just sweet. Listen to this sweet statement she makes. "I hope this will not be a war of emancipation, but of extermination, and that all under the influence of the foul fiend may be driven like swine into the sea. May we carry fire and sword into their states till not one habitation is left standing." Isn't she a sweet lady? I mean, she's just the epitome of sweet kindness, sweet Southern genteel kindness. I just want to hug that grandma. Isn't it? She's just so sweet. I think it's always fun to compare her statements with people like, Robert E. Lee's wife, who was very magnanimous at first, and bitter as they took her house, and rightfully so. But when you look at what Southern women were saying, it's just, no one ever said anything like this in the South. The Southern women, but you had this in the North, It's amazing how people think that these Northerners were just so nice, and they were just doing things as good moral people out there doing good moral things to help poor downtrodden populations. When you publish something like that, it's clear it wasn't. On Thursday, we had a piece by John Devaney, another one of Dr. Wilson's students, and he always writes very interesting stuff. And this is a piece where it looks like it's talking about the Donald Trump phenomenon and how far we've gone in American political discourse. And he says this: "Unfortunately, this will only confirm a terrible fact." And he's talking about Clinton's investigation, the investigation of Hillary Clinton's wrongdoing, and that she's committed felonies, and that nothing really is going to probably come out of this. But he says this, that America, much like China, has become a country where the rule by law prevails, not the rule of law, as one would expect in a republic. He says, "From what I can tell, most of the angst generated by Mr. Trump centers on his lack of political correctness and a kind of social oafishness he exhibits in public. Yet all of the candidates he is the most likely to be pragmatic, flexible, and willing to cut deals as the president. Of course, this means that peace may break out in the Middle East, and horrors, we can't have that." He also has a strong appeal to old Reagan Democrats and old Southern Democrats, lately turned Republican. Establishment Republicans are terrified at the thought that these two groups may, against the establishment wishes, put the man in the White House. The old boys club and the Republican Party are still resentful that these folks did not turn out in 2012 to vote for Romney, even though Romney bore an eerie resemblance to the man who laid them off in 2008 and got a bonus for it. So he's pointing out that, again, this is part of the problem in our political process. People have been talking about Trump for a while now, but it's the reason Trump is successful. And one of the things I've said about Trump, the reason Trump is successful, and it's because people are angry, but their anger is misguided, and they firmly believe. And Dr. Devaney is getting into this eventually. I firmly believe the problem is that people don't fundamentally understand. They know the system is broken, but they don't know why, and they don't know how to fix it, so they're thinking that electing somebody better or just somebody from the outside will fix it. The real problem is we have no representative government in the Capitol in D.C. We have none. And if you look at the numbers, it's striking. Our representative ratio is 735,000 to 1 in the House of Representatives. In some states, it's as low as 3,000 to 1. So where do you have real representative government? Obviously at the states. So we're looking at the central authority because we've been conditioned because of people like Sherman. This goes back to Sherman in so many ways when he says the United States is sovereign. That's our land. And people look at our political structure that way. That we have a national authority, a national government, everything is top down, all issues have to be decided by the top, whether it's how somebody sneezes, or if you have a puddle in your yard, the EPA can regulate that. It's all top down. But this is what we're doing at the Abbeville Institute, is exploring how that's not true. That the real basis of American government has always been bottom up. Even secession was a bottom up process in 60 and 61. That's what we should be getting at. This is what, if people could just focus on that and recognize it, their anger is misguided. They should be angry at the entire system, and electing somebody else is not going to change it. Though I think that people do recognize something is broken. And Dr. Devaney gets into that. Of course, this voting thing is fraught with its own perils. The public choice school has some excellent studies on the severe limitations, I am being kind and understanding this the case, on voting as a means to reach a social consensus. And it's not just that. Voting for someone better is not going to change the system because we still don't have any representative government. It's not that, and people on the left, again, there's some good, some people out there who think that this is the system is broken because of money. That's not necessarily the case. The system is broken because we don't have real representative government. It's not just the money is a factor because they know that they have an easy access to these political class in D.C. and they can do whatever they want because there's no oversight. And so Dr. Devaney gets back to what needs to happen is we need Virginians. He says it's too easy to forget that Virginia gave to the Union four of its first five presidents, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe. Towering statesmen and jurists also adorn her roll of honor. Aside from the presidents mentioned above, there are Patrick Henry, Edmund Pendleton, Edmund Randolph, George Mason, John Randolph, and John Taylor of Caroline. The jurists include John Marshall, Henry St. George Tucker, and Spencer Rowan. I'm committing sins of omission from the list, which I am sure will be corrected. Note that these men always, not that these men always agreed with each other, or that I agree with them. Yet, which other state can boast this constellation? If some Virginians were too desirous of extending the federal government's power, others rose swift to rebuke the heresy. What can be said of all is that they were Republicans, and thus knew that property and power could not be separated, only transferred. Landed property with power would tend to check or at least slow the expansion of government. Property and capital loves a large, active government working in its interest. And capital can always purchase a mob. So what we need to get back to is this idea of the states being central. Not just that, the community and the individual and your family being sovereign. Taking care of your own backyard first. This is important. It is the Southern tradition. The last piece for the week was actually something that was published a couple of years ago, but since we had very few readers a couple of years ago, and we didn't have this podcast, a lot of people didn't see this, and so every now and then we do this, we'll run something that was a couple of years ago, repost it so more people can see it. But of course, this is Good Friday. I'm recording this on Good Friday, and Sunday is Easter. And I wrote this a couple of years ago, it's a rural Southern Easter, talking about a couple of things, interesting things that I thought people should be aware of. But this is about, first part of the piece is about Benjamin Franklin White, who was actually born in 1800 in South Carolina. He was a Southern music pioneer, and he collected a series of hymns called the Sacred Harp, and it was published in 1844, and it was based on shape note singing. And this was the standard hymnal in the South. And the reason I became interested in White is because there's a little place just north of where I live called Whitesville, and it's named after Benjamin Franklin White. He actually moved to this area, and he had a little church near Columbus, Georgia, in Harris County, Georgia. He edited the first newspaper in Harris County called The Oregon, and he also was a clerk of the inferior court, but he was establishing essentially shape note singing. It was the textbook for the Southern Musical Convention for 2 decades, his book, The Sacred Harp. And the Chattahoochee Musical Convention and the East Texas Musical Convention still meet annually, and they're founded on White's work. So you have this guy in his local history for me, and Benjamin Franklin White, and it's very interesting that this type of music. Now, I was reared in Orthodox churches, and this is something that I never experienced going to church. But if you listen to shape note singing, it's such a powerful thing. It really is an amazing type of Americana to hear this type of music. So I actually included a video of shape note singing, and then also there's a little video from Bobby Horton, who's a Southern bard. I mean, he's such an amazing treasure because of his period music. And there's a little tune, Beach Spring, that it's actually a Benjamin Franklin White tune, and he records it on his Homespun Songs of Faith, Volume 2, and it's one of the more powerful songs I've ever heard, Christian songs I've ever heard recorded, but it's a Benjamin White tune. So I've got both up there in videos, and you can watch those. But again, a rural Southern Easter, this is uniquely Southern, this shape note singing, and it's a real interesting part of American and of course Southern culture. And of course, as we said, the South is America. This is real Americana. It's something that is native to the South, and of course became part of the Southern tradition. And as we explore what's true and valuable in the Southern tradition, this is definitely part of it. So we have the political tradition, but we also ended with a little culture and a little with John Devaney, introspective look at why Virginia is still important. So, that's the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute for March 21 through 25, 2016. Until next time, good day.